Well, joining me back for the panel discussion this evening, we have Patrick Zweifel, who is Chief Economist at Pictet Asset Management in Geneva.
Hello.
Cornelia Meyer, Economist and Energy Expert.
Hello.
Stefan Gerlach, Chief Economist at EFG Bank.
Good evening.
And Daniel Kalt, Chief Economist at UBS.
Hello.
So we're going to talk about monetary policy in this section of the programme. The US, Europe and Switzerland, we all have some kind of challenges in this area for the rest of into next year. 4 rate hikes so far for the Fed this year. The latest statement was pretty vague, it has to be said, really kind of setting up Jerome Powell for 2 rate hikes in 2019. Stefan Gerlach, is that your interpretation of what you heard?
Yes, one has to remember, though, that it's very difficult also for policymakers themselves to form a very firm view what they're going to do in the next 12 months, because that depends upon the economy. They are data dependent, as they say.
And there are so many things playing in.
And there are many
right
things playing in. My own suspicion is that we might only see one. And because there are a number of factors that are slowing the US economy. The dollar is important. The fact that the Fed has raised interest rates so many times, the cumulative effects of these things will be felt with some lag. So I think this will dampen the US economy this year. There have been increases that started in 2015. And from then on, it's going to dampen growth this year. We have concerns in emerging economies. We have Brexit. We have the Italian fiscal deal. We see what happens there and so on and so forth. So, and most importantly, the effects of the tax changes will start to evaporate this year. So, 1.
OK, so 1 rate hike next year for the Fed. Is anybody else on board with Stefan Gerlach on this?
Actually, I'm not. I mean, I would, like Stefan Gerlach, I would say it really depends on what happens. But if I then look at, if I take inflation into account, and in terms of real interest rates, I mean, we're still in a very low interest rate scenario. So I'm looking at that. So it really, I would say it depends, but we should not overestimate. We should not overestimate or underestimate that we still have very low real interest rates. The other thing is that the thing that worries me personally is, as we've talked about many times, is we need this arsenal. We need those instruments with which we can counter the next recession. And you know, interest rates are still very low. So how much lower can we go? You know, we've spent a lot of money. So that's what really worries me a bit.
Daniel Kalt.
Yeah, I think what we see is that visibility and uncertainty about how the US economy is going to evolve from here has certainly declined. And I think that's exactly what Powell tells us. We're slowing down. I mean, early December, he said, what do you do when you walk into your living room and lights suddenly go out? You slow down. You don't walk the same speed into your living room. You could hurt yourself. But that's exactly what they're doing right now. They're just slowing down the pace and becoming more data dependent, I think. So we're going to see, if everything pans up well, we're going to see 2 hikes. If things turn down too much, we might see only 1.
Stefan, I see you're itching to talk.
We should remember now that I mean, if we have a slowdown, the Fed can actually cut interest rates by 225 basis points, an option they haven't had in the past for quite some time. So they have a long distance to go. And in Europe, I think there has been a fundamental rethink about what fiscal policy should be in a downturn. I mean, if you go back, it was this notion of austerity and so on and so forth. I don't think the intellectual environment for more austerity now. I think they would just expand. We will see fiscal expansion in the countries in Europe that could do it if we had a big slowdown in Europe. So I think the landscape has shifted.
Patrick Zweifel.
I tend to think that dots could be pretty correct, at least given the information that we have today. So assuming that the cycle could actually last again a bit longer, we're talking about another 2 rate hikes. So that would bring us like pretty much around the neutral rate, while in previous or in normal cycle, you would actually overshoot that neutral rate. So just going there, so it's highly vague, this neutral rate.
Sure.
But assuming it's around like 2.5, 3, another 2 rate hikes would bring their at these levels. Would agree with Cornelia on the fact that underlying, so inflation remain low now, but we're still in around 2%. So and they would probably tolerate a bit more. Would agree with that, but underlying pressures are still there, despite lower oil prices and so on. So I think this is still one thing that we need to keep in mind. So 2 rates for me looks 2 rate hikes for the timing looks realistic.
Okay, I think one thing that I have to take away is that there is an awful lot of uncertainty, and that's what they're building into this kind of statement, this most recent statement anyway. And I'm wondering how much of this uncertainty is down to how much politics has permeated into economics under the Trump administration.
I would say very, very much, because we saw this, and I actually had just recently did an op-ed where I said we had all these man-made issues. I mean, the trade issues were man-made issues. Brexit was a man-made issue. The latest woes of the Italian budget is a man-made issue of a coalition government that's out of sync with each other, with the two fractions with each other. So politics have, not just in the United States, also in Europe, in many parts of the world, politics have really taken the front seat.
And potentially protectionism as well. Yeah. And is that not what's driving all of this? I mean, we have Italy, we have Brexit, even in France. Patrick, how is this all playing into the general European slowdown if we can move away from the Fed?
Well, the rise of, there's a lot of debate around that, whether populism has really been the consequence of a great financial crisis. I mean, we have examples back in the 30s. I tend to think that, well, that's a normal reaction. What is very bad with populism, we all know that. I mean, it's based on, let's say, four main policies, so less immigration, protectionism, more tax cuts, more government spending. All those policies tend to be good for the short term. We've seen that with Trump, but tend to be very bad for the long term. So this is obviously what I'm concerned about as an economist, because especially what Europe needs, and especially Italy, when you look at all those determinants for long-term growth, Italy ranks like 10 out of 11, according to our scorecard or whatever. So Italy really needs like structural, profound reforms and do not need something that would actually support short-term growth. So this is a big debate for 2019.
And I can't see that those structural reforms, neither in Italy, nor in France, nor where else it can come. We saw the structural reforms in Germany. Actually, Gerhard Schröder set Germany up when he did the hard sphere at the dawn of the century. And I just don't see that determination anywhere of somebody saying, OK, we've got to do a few things. Maybe I won't get re-elected, but it's got to be done.
The Italian budget deal, I mean, what does that mean?
I mean, we can now avoid this excess deficit procedure, I guess. So that's kind of it's a fudge, of course. But we all know that structurally, all these government households are in really bad shape. Think about this: we are in the late phase of a long recovery where we should have full employment. We should have budget surpluses all around to prepare us for the next downturn, so that you have some ammunition on the fiscal side to countersteer a next downturn. We are now talking about 2.5%, 3% in France of budget deficit at the height of the business cycle. So this is also showing, besides the fact that Europe does not have the levers on the monetary policy side, because the ECB is still at the zero line or below. So this makes it really very tough for the Europeans to go into the next recession.
Challenge that. Exactly the numbers you mentioned. For me, 2, 2.5, 3, it's fine. I think in Europe we're making a big deal.
I think this is right. I think this is right. I mean, sort of interrupting you, but this 3%, this is a man-made number. It comes from the Maastricht Treaty. In some cases, you could have much larger budget deficit, and not have a problem. And in some countries, in some cases, 3% is a problem. So I think there is, in fact, room. Some countries do have room to go beyond 3%, and the world will not implode upon them.
So it's okay for France, but not Italy?
It's more for Italy than I think for France. I mean, what's going to happen in France, I think, my suspicion is that these Macron decisions will in fact be very expansionary in France, because there's a fundamental difference between France and Italy. If you go back to Italian situation during the fall, talk about more spending and so on and so forth, that would have been expansionary, but interest rates started to rise, choking that off. The net effect probably zero. What about in France? Talk about more spending, more outlays and so on, but no impact on interest rates. So you only have the positive spending effect. To my mind, it's quite plausible that deficit next year in France will be below 3%. This will really give the economy a boost.
And just since we are on this, I think what really matters is how the spending or the tax cuts are made. And if you just take one example between Italy and France, Macron talked about increasing the SMIC, which is still encouraging having a job, while in Italy we're talking about just income given to people, which actually encourages people not to work. So I guess the way it's spent, even we start talking about the same amount, the impact on the economy will be different, and that's key to watch as well.
I'm very glad you came to that, because the one thing that I felt was missing so far is, yes, we're talking up here on the monetary policy level, but down here we have the issue of employment and economies. When you have youth unemployment that exceeds, 30–40%, and people without a perspective, it's very hard to really get the economy going, because people who are not in work won't consume, and that's not good for the economy. And that's where we need structural reforms in Italy. We probably also need structural reforms in France. In many countries, we need those structural reforms.
Okay, but cumulatively, we are talking about the ECB and their monetary policy going into 2019. Quantitative easing has come to an end. Daniel Kalt, Mario Draghi's last year, possibly his toughest.
Certainly, yeah. And the question will be, will he try the same as Mr. Trichet tried, namely to start the hiking cycle as he goes out? Probably, I would suggest or guess, difficult for him to still start this while in his last weeks, so it's going to be end of the year probably when they can do a first hike at best. And it makes it a very, very slow process, I think.
So I agree with that. I mean, an interest rate hike from the ECB may come at the earliest at the end of the year. But in fact, I tend to think that his last year will be the easiest year. The hardest year was the first year. Remember, he became president in the fall of 2011. By the summer of 2012, we have this whatever it takes comment. The announcement of OMT and so on and so forth. He had to persuade large swaths of Europe that this was in fact both necessary and compatible with the treaty. And he had to overcome dissenting opinions within the governing council and so on and so forth. So in fact, I think he would probably say, well, that was the toughest year, and since then everything has gone more and more smoothly.
Who do you think will replace him? It's probably potentially too early to discuss that, but is there anybody willing to
discuss
to put
So one way to think about this is that is to say that the vice president comes from a quote-unquote southern country, so then you want to have a president from a northern country. The vice president does not really have a background in monetary policy, so then you want to have someone who has a background in monetary policy as president. Then he comes from a large country, so then you want to have someone from a small country. I mean, it's a sort of standard balancing argument, and that suggests, for instance, that either the former governor of the Bank of Finland, Erkki Liikanen, who has been a European commissioner and who has been Minister of Finance in Finland, and who's widely seen as middle of the road, very reasonable, and so on and so forth, he might be a very good candidate, although he has retired last year. Or the current governor of the Bank of Finland, Olli Rehn, who has also been a commissioner, and been very much involved in these issues. So that's one possibility. But there are other options. Governor Villeroy of France, of course, is always a contender. It would be a package solution, and it's hard to figure out exactly what's going to go into this package, but there are at least two names for you.
Let's bring it back to Switzerland and the impact on the ECB here in this country. Is it so tightly tied that we're almost trapped by the decision-making of the ECB, do you think?
It starts obviously through the exchange rates and through how much obviously we exchange with the ECB. I guess what makes, in my mind, what always makes the decision hard by the SNB is linked to the movement in the Swiss franc. So I tend to think that when the Swiss franc is actually weakening, it's much easier for the SNB to start normalizing rates. We know that they hate their negative rates, so I guess the sooner they can abandon this territory, they'll do it. And for this to happen, you need actually, I don't think you need the Swiss franc to depreciate, really. You need to have a Swiss franc which actually looks cheap versus any kind of fair value, and therefore they would actually agree to start normalizing rates. I think having had those discussions with the SNB many times, where we completely differ is where we see the Swiss franc relative to fair value. But the Swiss franc obviously appreciate over time versus many currencies. So the trend must be, even for the fair value, to go higher and higher. So at one point in time, the Swiss franc will look actually cheap, which will allow the SNB to start normalizing rates. And that could happen. So for the timing, we expect this to happen end of 2019, but it could actually happen earlier.
Well, I would say that the SNB has to sort of weigh up sort of various goods, so what is the higher good. On one hand, as you said very, very eloquently, the low interest rates, or the negative interest rates have had a real effect, a real cost if you think of pension funds, banking and so on. It has had a real cost. And so you have those stakeholders. On the other hand, you have the stakeholders who really depend on a Swiss franc that is not overvalued, so they can still export. So they need to find that golden middle. And I would say a lot of it, I would agree with you sort of towards the end of this year, but or next year, 2019. But it really also depends on what happens in between. If suddenly the euro, because of Brexit, or Italy really, really goes down, and the dollar goes down for some reason, the Swiss franc is a safe haven, well, then it would be very hard to do it.
Let's just bring in you, Stefan Gerlach. What's your outlook for Switzerland as a strong economy in 2019?
Well, we'll continue to be a strong economy. I mean, the Swiss economy, if you go back to 2015, when they gave up the floor on the exchange rate, and we had a sharp appreciation of the Swiss franc. That was problematic for some firms, but the unemployment rate rose. I might have a decimal wrong here, from 3 to 3.2% or something like that. That had no impact very little impact on the economy. And I think the same is true also now. The economy is fundamentally very strong, and Swiss firms are very good at dealing with episodes of exchange rate appreciation. So things look good. And I do think, in fact, that if the SNB was to raise interest rates from -75, which is a world record, to -50, which also be the world record, that would not have a big impact on the exchange rate nor on the economy.
Final word to you, Daniel Kalt.
Yeah, I mean, the Swiss economy is doing very well. I mean, we had 3.5% growth roughly in the first half of 18, double the speed limit of the Swiss economy. And we've overcome that Swiss franc shock from early 15 very, very well. So we're really in a very solid state, and we're still among the most competitive economies globally. And therefore, I also think the SNB has to weigh the benefits of having negative rates against the cost of having negative interest rates. And the costs accumulate constantly and become bigger and bigger, and the balance is churning increasingly against this cost-benefit balance of having negative rates. So sooner or later, they should get out or try to get out there.
Okay, well, thank you all very much indeed for joining us for this very lively discussion this evening. That is it from us here for now. There's plenty